From the idea then of inversion, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of the supersensible world, we must eliminate the sensuous idea of fixing the differences in a different sustaining element. And this absolute notion of the difference must be represented and understood purely as inner difference, as a repulsion of the self-same as self-same from itself, and likeness of the unlike as unlike. We have to think pure change, or think antithesis within the antithesis itself, or contradiction. For in the difference which is an inner difference, the opposite is not merely one of two. If it were, it would simply be without being an opposite. But it is the opposite of an opposite, or the other is itself immediately present in it. Certainly, I put the opposite here and the other of which it is the opposite there. The opposite then is on one side, is in and for itself without the other. But just because I have the opposite here in and for itself, it is the opposite of itself. Or it has, in fact, the other immediately present in it. Thus, the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time overarched the other world and has it within it. It is for itself the inverted world, that is the inversion of itself. It is itself and is its opposite in one unity. Only thus is it difference as inner difference, or difference in its own self, or difference as an infinity. In section 160, we're now getting pretty close to the end of this section of the Phenomenology of Spirit, that is, force and the understanding. So, as with the previous sections, we should expect to see Hegel starting to draw things into, you might say, a knot, starting to tie the different threads that he's put into play together. We should also expect to see him getting us ready to move into the next section. What's going to be developed more thematically in the next section, where he's talking about self-consciousness, is going to be brought up in this section. That's why there's a transition from one section to the other. Now, what he's doing in this particular paragraph is, you might say, lingering over and deepening and making totally clear a set of metaphysical points that have to do with the whole Hegelian system as he's developing it here phenomenologically, as he will show it to us later in a more systematized way in the logics. So he's going to talk about inversion. You know, so I've got inversion up here, and then I've got this discussion of pure change and what it leads into, and these different kinds of, you might say, metaphysical perspectives on things. But what's beginning this paragraph and what's ending it is discussion of something that we've been talking about now for a little bit, the inverted world, or the supersensible world. So let's actually look at that, because that bookends the entire discussion. He says, from the idea then of inversion, which we're going to hit in just a minute, which constitutes the essential nature of one aspect of the supersensible world. So that's important to focus on. Here in this paragraph, he's not saying that inversion is the only characteristic, the only aspect of the supersensible world. Usually within Hegelian philosophy, any important thing is going to have a number of different features, a number of different sides. So we shouldn't try to be reductive here and talk about the supersensible world as merely the inverted world, but that is one important characteristic of it, something that we can develop a lot of theses or ideas from, realizations. So where is he going to go with this? As we go through all this material, where is it going to conclude at the end of this paragraph? He's going to say, the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time overarched the other world and has it within it. It's encompassed the other world. And what was the other world? Well, it could be the first supersensible world, and we've already seen that's been rolled into this, and it could also be the sensible world, the world of mere appearances, of show, of the things that we are understanding through using concepts like force or law, which we are doing ourselves by means of the understanding. So there really is only one world. It has different aspects to it. We can analyze it phenomenologically by attending to consciousness, as Hegel has done here, into a world of appearance and then a supersensible world, but they're really all enfolded together. There's no opposition between them that, you know, would give us a sort of Platonic world of the forms, which is real, and then, you know, world of appearances or material things, which is, you know, at best knockoff copies or anything like that. It's all one world for Hegel. So he says, it is for itself the inverted world, inversion of itself. This is a really important point. The inverted world is not simply an inversion of the world of appearances or even the world of, we might say, essences, if we like that, the first supersensible world. It encompasses them, and in doing so, you might say in contaminating those other worlds and bringing them in together, showing us that this is all features of the world that is real, it is an inversion not only of them, but also of itself. Inversion is at its very core. So he says, it is itself and its opposite in one unity. This is a thought that Hegel requires us to think over and over again. A thing being itself and its other or its opposite or its contradiction in one unity. When we try to do that, we have to exert ourselves mentally. It's not something that is right there, you know, low-hanging fruit on the surface, ready for us to grasp. So he says, only thus is its difference inner difference, or difference in its own self, or difference as an infinity. This is going to play an important role, this notion of difference as an infinity, as unlimited, as continually becoming something more. So this should caution us against thinking that by, you know, writing down a few schemas on the chalkboard, we have, you know, thoroughly grasped what Hegel is talking about here. We have to do the work of thinking through this. This is part of, to foreshadow a bit, this is part of what's going to lead us beyond the understanding itself and show us the limits of the understanding. Now, let's talk about what I've put on the board. Wouldn't be much point putting it on the board if we weren't going to. So, two different ways of thinking about inversion that he covers in this paragraph. One would be that the differences involved in the inversion are fixed in a different sustaining element, so that they're treated essentially as, you might say, qualifications or modes, however you want to think of it, of a substance, of something that remains the same throughout all of this. And remember, you know, the classic impulse of metaphysics was to try to uncover, at least one classic impulse, what remains the same in the course of change. So in the course of inversion, which is a type of change here, can the differences be fixed in a different, that is, an alien to them, something other than them, a different sustaining element? Hegel says, no. Instead, we have to understand the inversion as inner difference. Now, he's developed this concept of inner difference for us quite a lot in this section, and also in previous sections, particularly in the preface. So you might want to go back to the preface or certain parts of the introduction in order to make sense of this, if this is, you know, throwing you for a loop. What does it mean for inversion to be understood as inner difference? Well, this is stuff that we've seen already, right? A repulsion of the self-same from itself. The self-same doesn't remain self-same because part of the nature of the self-same within the Hegelian system is to push itself out there, to other itself, to create difference, to, you might say, project something that is not yet. So there's a repulsion within the self-same from itself, and then there's a likeness of the unlike as unlike. Things that are unlike also bear a certain relationship to each other that establishes likeness. That which is unlike itself, and here we should be thinking a little bit ahead to what's coming up, self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is unlike to itself, and yet it is also a unity. So Hegel is saying this is what's going on in the process of inversion. Remember, who's carrying out the inversion? Back behind the scenes, it's consciousness, or what part of consciousness? The understanding. Now, after that, he's going to have this great sentence where he says, here we go, we have to think pure change. Also, pure change is Wechsel. I'm going to read the sentence. We must think pure change or think antithesis within the antithesis itself or contradiction. For in the difference, which is an inner difference, the opposite is not merely one of two. That's what we're going to get to here. So let's linger over that sentence a little bit, because the terminology can be useful to think about, and we want to work our way through this. This is really, I would say, one of the key sentences, not only in this paragraph, but in this entire section. We have to think pure change, or think antithesis within the antithesis itself, or contradiction. Pure change here is Wechsel. That's how it's being translated. Now, you could understand that as change, or you could understand that as exchange. You know, when you change money, you're actually exchanging one type of bill, or, I don't know, coin or whatever, for another. Now, notice, too, if we use that metaphor, we're not talking about trading one thing that is what it is in itself, you know, irregardless of its relations with everything else, for another thing that is itself, like, you know, we're going from red stuff to blue stuff. Even going from red to blue stuff presumes some sort of observer who's able to take in red and blue and make some sense out of them. But when we're talking about money, that's why this example is particularly apt in bringing out some important aspects of Hegel's doctrine. When we're talking about money, we're talking about something that has meaning within a whole system of relations. Money doesn't have its meaning even just as a physical object, as the banknote or as the coin. It doesn't have its full meaning in and of itself, intrinsic to itself. It has it only in relation to all the things that you can do with it, what you can exchange it for, your own conception of it, that guy over there's conception of it, which isn't necessarily the same as yours, but you assume is the same as yours. So when we're talking about inversion, we should think about the inversions that Hegel has talked about so far as occurring within a system of relations. That's part of what it meant to talk about force or to talk about law anyway. And the understanding, you might say, is the force of forces or the law of laws, uniting all these things together and observing them. So that's change, right? Within pure change, we must, he says, think antithesis within the antithesis itself. Antithesis is Entgegensetzung, right? And if you break this term down, Setzung, placing, right? Entgegen means against, and the ent here is you know, conjuring something like a distancing, or it's a reinforcer. So Entgegensetzung is antithesis, but it's not antithesis in the sense of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the way that people want to reduce Hegel to. It means two things being set into opposition, set into relief, placed against each other, right? So I have two pieces of chalk, right? And I'm trying to clack them together. I am, you know, opposing them to each other by doing so. In another way, the chalk is opposed to the eraser, is it not? Right? This is, you know, entgegengesetzt. This is opposed. This is the antithesis of this. In a certain way, they're both opposed to the chalkboard. We have a whole system of relations here, don't we? We can talk about, well, who actually does all this? This guy here. I suppose my pockets, but I'm always finding chalk in a certain way, you know, an antithesis of the chalk, because they're always swallowing it up, and then I find it in my pockets later. Contradiction, Widerspruch, is a bit stronger than Entgegensetzung. Strictly speaking, in formal logic, which Hegel is taking us far beyond, a contradiction has to do with two things not being able to be compatible, not being able to be the case. We can also talk about, the principle of a thing not being able to be A and not A at the same time, in the same way, in the same place, blah, 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 blah. There's all sorts of qualifiers. But when we talk about contradiction, we're bringing to light something that has a yet even greater sense of opposition within it than just antithesis, just opposing things to each other. So we want to be able to think this out. Remember, for Hegel, contradiction is something that doesn't stop us, or it doesn't need to stop us. It will stop many of the individual shapes of consciousness throughout history and over the course of things, because they won't develop. But it's what pushes the process itself forward of the development of consciousness through human history and culture. So he says, in the difference, which is an inner difference, the opposite is not merely one of two. So we're actually having, I'm drawing some stuff out here that Hegel's not explicitly saying in terms of what he is explicitly saying. He's opposing his viewpoint to what we might call a substance ontology way of looking at things. Aristotle, in his metaphysics and in many of his other works, would seem to fit this. A lot of thinkers would. The Cartesians, in their own way, whether we're talking about Descartes or Leibniz or Malebranche or Spinoza, they would fit into that. People like, the British empiricists, even though they say we have a very hazy idea of substance, they're still treating things in this way. There's a sort of mentality that goes along with this. And when Hegel is trying to talk about opposition, he wants to resist this point of view. So what would this point of view be over here? Well, it's that the opposite is merely one of two opposites. That's the way he talks about it. What does that mean? The opposite is merely one of two opposites. There's, first of all, the thing, and then it can be an opposite. And these opposites exist in themselves as what they are before they become opposites. Or, even if we're talking about, cosmic principles like the Greeks thought about hot and cold being opposites to each other, hot is what it is, and then it happens to be opposed to the cold. It's not as if, the hot and the cold exist as what they are precisely because of their opposition. No, they are what they are, and then because of what they are opposed to each other extrinsically. That is, from the outside. Another way of thinking about this is that substances precede relations of substances. So substances are prior, substances exist, then they can be in relations with things. Those relations are merely accidental, as Aristotle said, even if they happen to be, properly accidental. That was a concept he had to bring in to make sense of some things that are particularly important. Even if they're closer to the essence of the thing, they're not of the essence of the thing. Hegel wants to get away from this. Instead, what he says is the opposite of an opposite. Now, what does that mean? That's kind of a funny way to put things, isn't it? The opposite is what it is only by its opposition to something else, and that opposition is going to, in a certain way, precede, at least phenomenologically, the being of the thing. We get to know things through opposition, in large part. So he says the other is immediately present in the opposite. Opposites are not, totally detached from each other. They're not merely Entgegengesetzt. They're not merely at a distance from each other. By being in contradiction with each other, think of a contradiction as something like two people who can't stand each other and yet love each other so much that they can't be without each other either. They make each other miserable, but they can't imagine life apart from each other. That's what a contradiction really is in Hegelian terms, if not in formal logic terms. Formal logic is a really hard time, by the way, explaining just how contradiction works. Well, it does work, and here's what happens when you do it. But getting to the very ground of what contradiction would be, there's really no answers there. Hegel's trying to provide answers to us. The other is immediately present in it. The opposite is present within its opposite. Now, you can say here that the relation of opposite or opposition, I put a little slash here, assumes a kind of priority for Hegel. That's what he's trying to get at. Now, you might say then, here would be a mistaken point of view. Let's get away from substance ontology. Let's get more to something like process ontology, And then you say, it's really, the relations themselves that matter. The things themselves are just sort of like nodes in a network or something like that. Hegel's not going that far. He would consider that swinging too far to the other extreme. That's why he's talking about an inner difference. This is a opposition dynamic. This is how opposition is happening. The things themselves that are opposed, the opposites, do matter. In the inversion, to get back to what this whole paragraph was hitting at, the inversion that's taking place through the inverting world, not just the inverted world, the inverting world that is part of the world, that is revealing to us the way the world is, this is inner difference. This is getting us towards what Hegel is now going to call infinity, precisely because it happens within each opposition and each opposed member of the opposition. That through infinity, law completes itself into an immanent necessity, and all the moments of the world of appearance are taken up into the inner world. That the simple character of law as infinity means, according to what we have found, A, that it is self-identical, but is also in itself different, or it is the self-same which repels itself from itself or sunders itself into two. What was called simple force duplicates itself, and through its infinity is law. B, what is thus dirempted, which constitutes the parts thought of as in the law, exhibits itself as a stable existence. And if the parts are considered without the notion of the inner difference, then space and time, or distance and velocity, which appear as moments of gravity, are just as indifferent and without a necessary relation to one another as to gravity itself. Or as this simple gravity is indifferent to them, or again, as simple electricity is indifferent to positive and negative electricity. But, see, through the notion of inner difference, these unlike and indifferent moments, space and time, and so forth, are a difference which is no difference, or only a difference of what is self-same, and its essence is unity. As positive and negative, they stimulate each other into activity, and their being is rather to posit themselves as not being, and to suspend themselves in the unity. The two distinguished moments both subsist. They are the implicit and are opposites in themselves. That is, each is the opposite of itself. Each has its other within it, and they are only one unity. 161 is another one of these retrace our steps, summarize, and get ready to move on sorts of paragraphs. Here, Hegel is talking explicitly about law, but everything that he's saying here about law can equally apply to force. For the understanding, as we've seen, law and force appear to be something different at first, but turn out to be mutually intertwined with each other. So he says that we need to talk about law as infinity. He says, we see that through infinity, law completes itself into an immanent necessity, right? And I wanted to signal this term immanent right here. Miller, I understand why he's introducing that particular term. He's, the Hegel's German here is, that necessity an ihm selbst vollendet, right? It fulfills itself, it perfects itself, it comes to an end, it comes to its final state, it comes to where it's supposed to be. An ihm selbst, you can say, okay, now I understand why he's saying immanent. It's immanent in the sense that not of being immanent within the world, but present to itself, all there, right? So that might be a little bit misleading at first, but focus on what he's talking about as law as infinity. That's what this process here is going to show us. He says law completes itself into a necessity. It shows us a necessary development, one that actually in one of these steps is going to show us how a lack of necessity gets taken up into necessity. So where necessity doesn't appear to be, consciousness has to probe a bit further and then it will find it. So he says, all the moments of the world of appearance are taken up into the inner world. What he's describing here is the process by which these worlds, the world of appearance, the inner world or the inverted world, the supersensible world, but how they're coming together with each other. So we've got a three-step process that's charted out here. I'm just following along with the designators that are given in the text. He says the simple character of law, that the simple character of law is infinity, is unlimited, is, unendlich, is without a barrier, without some sort of end, without some sort of here it stops. The fact that law, the character of law is infinity, means that it's, like he says, self-identical. So what does that mean? That means that it's also going to be different. Because as we've seen, nothing is purely self-identical without already introducing difference. As a matter of fact, what we often think of as something just being identical to itself is really an abstraction. In reality, the things that are self-identical are self-othering. So law separates or sunders or splits, however you want to put it, into two laws or into multiple laws. We've seen a variety of possibilities for this. And here, he's going to say the same thing is happening with force, right? What was called simple force duplicates itself, and through its infinity is law. So a law can take in multiple forces. We've seen this entire dialectic play out of the law, splitting into multiple laws, trying to reincorporate itself into one single law. The entire time, by the way, it's been the understanding that's been carrying that out. Now, the next part of the movement, he says, the parts falling into the law, the things that are coming under the law, that are its determinacy, we could say. He says, what's dirempted, which constitutes the parts thought of as in the law, exhibits itself as a stable existence. I put stable existences here because he's talking about multiple things. He gives the examples of considering motion and space and time, or distance and velocity, which appear as moments of gravity, or we might just say moments of physical, laws governing bodies more generally, instead of just gravity. These things come to be treated as, they're just what they are. Space is space, time is time, distance is distance, velocity is velocity. Notice what we're doing there. We're making things self-same. And when we do that, when we sort of take them for granted like that in what we might call the ordinary attitude, the undialectical attitude, what we do is we're considering them without the notion, without the concept. We're doing something that the understanding can take in, but something that is not dialectical, something that, working them through in terms of the concept, the begriff, the notion, is going to reveal as shot through with all sorts of holes, all sorts of things that don't turn out to be the way we assumed, and are much more interesting, by the way. This means that we treat them as indifferent to each other, and in a certain way as indifferent to the law itself, or the force that the law is supposed to be expressing and determining. We say that they have no necessary relation to each other. So, we saw Hegel talk about this with, opposites, the positive, the negative, just got them there, and they're not really that connected with each other. They just happen to be opposed to each other. That's no necessary relation. Space, time, distance, velocity, you can talk about all these things, but they're really independent of each other, and they're not interrelated, and so there's really no necessary connection between them. And he gives you a couple of different examples of this. That's not where we want to stop, and that's not where law as infinity is going to stop, but that's the way a lot of people, when they're engaging with law understood in this sense, and we can talk about law not only in terms of physical activity, but also in terms of moral laws. That's the way a lot of people tend to grasp law. Hegel doesn't stop there. He says, once we do introduce the notion, the concept of inner difference, these parts, or now he's calling them moments, are in fact a difference that is no difference. We've seen this dynamic before, haven't we? Where what appears to be a difference turns out, just sort of an extrinsic difference, turns out not to be a difference that makes a difference, not to be a difference that really matters. So he says, only a difference of what is self-same, and its essence, here's the key thing, their essence or their meaning lies in their unity. So now it's no longer in themselves, it's in another. And the other is this unity, which is of them, right? It's a unifying them together. So he says, as positive and negative, they stimulate each other into activity. Their being is rather to posit themselves as not being, and to suspend themselves in the unity. The two distinguished moments both subsist. They are implicit and opposite in themselves. Each is the opposite of itself. This is what law is revealing to us when we work it through. Each has its other within it, and they are only one unity. It has its other within it precisely because there is this unity. Now here's the question that Hegel doesn't answer in this paragraph, and we want to think about as we're moving to other paragraphs. Where does this unity come from? What gives this stuff that unity? Does it just happen to show up? Well, that wouldn't be any sort of necessity, would it? It's not much of an answer in metaphysics to say, well, that's just the way it is. Even saying, well, that's the way it's got to be, that's a little bit more along the lines of necessity than, well, it's just what we observe, just what happens to be the case. We want to think, as we're moving forward, what is the ground, what is the producer of this unity?